background to the current situation. Now we have Lindsey, the convener of Stop the War.
Okay, well, thanks very much, Chris. I want to follow on very much from what Joe has said. I mean, I think that he's given a very, very good outline of the history, the recent history of Iraq and the consequences of the interventions going back now decades, if you include the sanctions and the first Gulf War and all these other kind of things. And I want to perhaps make the point that, and I think somebody made this yesterday in one of the discussions, that actually what they do when they intervene is far from creating kind of healthy, democratic, vibrant states. They create failed states. That there were many, many problems with Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and I hope I don't need to spell out that I was always very much opposed to his policy. But there was, and Joe of course was, it's one of the great slanders made against the anti-war movement that we're big fans of all these people who are opposed by the US and Britain. But I think it's quite remarkable what a disastrous situation they create, and in particular if you look at Iraq, what a disastrous situation they created there. And Joe's explained the kind of sectarianism which was deliberately fostered. And it's like with all these wars. I remember meeting somebody in London who was a Yugoslav, who was brought up as a Yugoslav in London, and he said he had no idea when the wars started there whether he was a Serb or a Croat, because his parents had just said, you're from Yugoslavia. And this was the same with Iraqis. People they may have known their grandmother was Kurdish or whatever it was, they followed a particular wing of the Muslim religion, but there was no sense that was what really defined them. And what they've done, we should remember, in 2003 when they invaded, there was a collapse of the infrastructure of the country. They systematically destroyed the army. Now again, I have absolutely no time for Saddam's Baathists and the Iraqi army and so on, but they destroyed any kind of standing army. They destroyed any infrastructure of the state. We know about the looting of the museums, of all these different sorts of things. And perhaps most importantly, in terms of what we discuss in the subsequent years, is they created a resistance immediately. I mean, one of the things that surprised me about Iraq in 2003 was as soon as they invaded, there was a resistance. And that grew up very, very quickly. And some of it, it came from all different parts of society, but some of it was the ex-army, was the Baathists, but it included all sorts of other people. And there was a huge conflict quite early on in the occupation in the city of Fallujah, which is in the west of the country, where the Americans did their best to destroy Fallujah, and they used white phosphorus. They behaved in the most brutal way. I mean, we look at the bombing of Gaza recently and the destruction of Gaza, but you look at Fallujah and you look at the same pictures, and over a longer period of time, and with collective punishment of the people of Fallujah. And I think you have to look at one of the roots of the present crisis in what they did in that part of Iraq. So I think that's the first thing. The fostering of the sectarianism is the second thing, and the conscious breaking up of the country. This was always the case going right back to 1990. One of the ways in which they tried to get a lock on Iraq was to support the Kurds in the north of the country, and effectively to give them their own protected area that was away from Saddam Hussein. Now, that was something that has continued, and actually in 2003 the Iraqi Kurds were some of the main supporters of the American invasion, as they have been with the recent intervention as well. Barzani, their main leader, is somebody who's extremely conservative, who's very much opposed by many Kurds as well on the ground. But they created the separateness of the Kurds. They made increasing divisions between the Sunni and the Shia, and at certain points they supported the Shia in the south. At other points they were the main enemy. If you remember Muqtada al-Sadr and the Sadr city uprising against the Americans, but they constantly were balancing these different groups. And I think if you look at that's something that's essentially continued. But what we've had over the last 2 or 3 years has been the increasing funding of the opposition to Bashar al-Assad in Syria. And what you've had there is not just the United States, although the United States has a huge input into this area, a huge, you know, they talk about 1,000 Russian troops in Ukraine. I mean, how many thousands of American troops do you think there are in Jordan and in Syria in itself and in all the places surrounding the country? So they did all of that. They created a situation where they refused ever to look for a political solution in Syria. They also always said it couldn't be done. Assad couldn't be part of the peace talks. The Iranians couldn't be part of the peace talks. It was said repeatedly. The consequence was the war continued. The various groups were funded by different people, including large amounts of money from Qatar, from Saudi Arabia, and large logistical support from the Turkish government. And the Turkish government, which is a NATO member, has allowed its borders to remain open so that ISIS still trades in oil across these borders. ISIS fighters have come into the country in that direction. All of these governments are very, very much complicit, and all of them have been backed by the Americans and the British. And if you cast your mind back to almost exactly a year ago, when we managed to defeat in the British Parliament the attempt by David Cameron, he brought the whole Parliament back from holiday several days earlier because Obama obviously wanted to bomb Syria that weekend. He brought them back and said, you know, we want to go for intervention. That was luckily was defeated in the British Parliament, which then meant that it also was something that Obama felt he couldn't put to the American Congress, and we avoided that. But they're now trying to do this again, and we now have the incredible situation where there is a bombing of Iraq again by the United States. This is going on, dressed up as a humanitarian intervention, but let's look even at the humanitarian intervention. It starts off as the Yazidis are stuck on a mountain, persecuted and fearing for their lives, quite rightly, from ISIS. We have to bomb in order to rescue these people. Now, actually, if you look at how these people were rescued, and many of them were rescued, it was that the Kurdish fighters, and not the Kurdish fighters most sympathetic to the Americans, by the way, the Kurdish fighters linked to the Turkish Kurdish PKK, which is listed as a terrorist organisation in this country and across Europe and the world, were the people who got them off the mountain. If you look at then it switched from being these poor people stuck on the mountain, you know, pictures of refugees and how terrible it is, because the Americans suddenly said, oh, we've done reconnaissance, it's not so bad up on the mountain, you know, it's perfectly okay. We thought they were all starving, but no, really, you know, there's obviously a McDonald's around the country, around the corner or something that they can go and get. So it's not so bad, so we're not going to bomb over that. But hey, we've just got this this video that's been released of this guy, this American journalist who's been executed, and anybody obviously who hears a description of this or looks at it, I haven't looked at it myself, not being probably most people here particularly prone to that kind of thing. But of course it's a horrific act. But should it really be the case for a war? Should it really be the case for more bombing? Because bombing by definition is going to kill far more people, and as Joe has said, you know, in terms of beheading in the region, it's hardly unique when you look at the record of Saudi Arabia, which beheads people for drug smuggling and all sorts of other things going on. So they use this as the excuse for intervention, and this is what's being argued now, that there is and the way it's put in this country, I don't know quite if it's exactly the same in the States, because this guy who is pictured in the video beheading the person, which by the way even sources close to MI5 say is not a genuine video. They say there was a genuine beheading, you know, this guy was executed, and that's horrific enough, but this looks like a sort of professionally made staged video, maybe by ISIS. I'm not saying made by anybody else, but what they're now saying is there's 500 British nationals fighting in Iraq. We now have this huge thing, should their passports be taken away from them, should their nationality be removed from them, all other things which are quite contrary to the most basic human rights of people, whatever they've done. I mean, if they've committed a crime, then there's all sorts of legal processes that can be gone through, but it's totally against their human rights. So of course this figure, now let's firstly remember, they know about most of these kids. this is what they're doing with their surveillance of the Muslim community, which is absolutely intense in this country and elsewhere. This is absolutely clear. Everybody knows that they know who most of these kids are. Everybody knows that many of the kids who get radicalised towards Islamic fundamentalism, if you want to put it like that, are people that, far from them deterring them from continuing on this path, they encourage them to become informers for the British state and the British security forces. This is not new. So the idea they don't know, they suddenly come up with this figure. They know about these people. They know where they cross the border. They know that they fly into Istanbul and all the other things. They know all this. So what is this about? This is about, firstly, banging the drum for war. Secondly, it's about cracking down again on civil liberties, which we've seen repeatedly over the last 13 years since the war on terror began. I mean, it's incredible when you think what the IRA did in Britain. The IRA had sustained bombing campaigns, including blowing up Margaret Thatcher's closest advisor in the House of Commons, and you never had anything like the kind of security and the surveillance that you now have, or the number of laws that you now have now. So it's about partly that. It's partly about Islamophobia, that this is becoming that the Muslims are, the Muslims in this country have been fantastically integrated into the anti-war movement and generally into the politics of protest around these questions against the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq and all these kind of things. But now it's the idea that the Muslims are somehow, there's something mysterious refusal of Parliament to go for bombing of Syria. They want to be able to do it, and we shouldn't believe that if they do start bombing Iraq, that will have terrible consequences in Iraq, but it will go to Syria as well, because what ISIS is doing, ISIS has taken Mosul. It's now back a path to the Mediterranean, and this is what it wants to do as well. And this will therefore bring, and we shouldn't believe it's about ISIS. They don't like Assad either, so it will be about Assad. So we have to be very, very clear that we oppose all of these things, and that we are still, unfortunately, living with the consequences of the disastrous intervention in Iraq.
Thank you very much. We've now got time for discussion. What I propose
over the Taliban. So I think we have to say, look, this isn't about what you think of all sorts of ways of all of these people. Anthony Medvedev, for example, who supported the war, were exiles, and I know lots of Iraqi exiles in London who are my age and older, who've been exiles since they were young people. They've made their lives in London because they couldn't go back to Iraq. So they have very, very good reason to oppose Saddam Hussein, but they understood that actually they actually predicted, and not unfortunately in the detail perhaps that it has turned out, but they predicted, and we predicted, the sorts of things that were being said. So I think we just need to say that this is a kind of cheap, it's a cheap argument, and unfortunately comes all too often from people in the Labour Party, above all from Tony Blair, who still in the Labour Party, I suppose, kind of just. But it's essentially an argument that if you're against this militarism, that you must be on the other side. And I just think we have to say it's not about that. The situation about the Kurds, I don't think I did oversimplify it. I mean, there are many different views of the Kurds. Again, in London, I work with a lot of the Kurds, with the Rojava Kurds from Syria, and with the PKK, the Turkish Kurds, which are by far the biggest grouping. And I support the Kurdish right to independence. I think they have the right to their own state, and this is a historic question which goes back nearly 100 years now in terms of the... they weren't given this state in the aftermath of the First World War and the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. And it's also true to say they're not, and I wasn't trying to say they're part of the religious sectarianism. The Kurdish question is a different question in terms of the state. Nonetheless, that state has been used repeatedly to support US imperialism, the Iraqi state in the north. There's absolutely no question about that. And while it's true the Syrian Kurds, the Rojava Kurds, are opposed to Assad, they're very much opposed to the FSA, and they're very much opposed to ISIS, and this is why they've got themselves into this position. So it is, my real belief about this is that and I think many of the Turkish Kurds feel the same way, is that they will get absolutely nothing from Barzani and the people in the Iraqi part, and that if they want their independence, they will have to fight those people, and not to mention the Turkish government, which is, there's an argument. I'm against giving arms to the Kurds. I'm absolutely against it because I think it is part of creating a ground force for the American airstrikes, and I'm absolutely against it in that sense. But there is no question if they do get arms from America or anywhere else, there will end up being a fight between them and Turkey. I think there's no question about that. So I think it's a big political question. I don't think we should just see the PKK as a left-wing organisation. I think that's slightly giving them a sort of, as has been said at certain points, a communist coloration. They're a national movement, and they're a national movement which has very impressive elements to it, including a lot of women involved, always centrally involved. And indeed, three women were assassinated in Paris last year, obviously by the Turkish state. So there's all that. But I think we need to look at it. We need to look at it in its entirety in terms of what is going on.
My question was really whether
hang on, Dennis.
Independence would
Dennis,
be
let
more
me
likely.
bring back
well,
Joe.
yeah. And just
Come
can
on.
I just
Go
answer
through the
the
chair,
last-
yeah?
That's my question.
Yeah, okay, well, sorry, well, maybe
Still
Joe
go through the chair.
can come back on it. But just the third point about the women's situation in Iraq. Iraq had one of the most modern societies in the Middle East in terms of women engineers, women doing all sorts of jobs like that. And, you know, a rejection of lots of the more traditional roles of women and so on. That has unfortunately changed, at least for many, many people. I mean, there's a general situation for women in Iraq, which is, you know, very large numbers of widows, very large numbers are having to cope with children without any support. They suffer all the problems that anybody would have without electricity and water and all the basic things. But as well as that, obviously, the question of whether women are allowed to be educated or have to wear the veil or any of these things, these are big questions, certainly in parts of Iraq. And obviously we have to oppose any restriction on women being able to do what they want. And I think this is, you know, another consequence of the occupation has actually been to make it more dangerous and more difficult for women in many, many parts of Iraq.
Thanks, Lindsey. Joe.
Well, just quickly, firstly, the points that were made, and Joe obviously referred to them a lot in his opening presentation, about the previous interventions, in particular the war with Kuwait, over Kuwait with Iraq in 1991, was absolutely hideous, and I think for lots of us was the first sort of sign that the post-Cold War world was going to be a lot nastier than we were promised by these people, and particularly the bombing of the retreating Iraqi army on the Basra Road. I don't know if people remember this, but you know, it was just an absolute war crime, really. It was an absolutely hideous thing to do. And it was one of the things that was the beginning of such a revulsion against it by public opinion in the United States and here and elsewhere. It was one of the things that stopped Bush from going to, you know, continuing to pursue them, that they felt they couldn't do it. So yeah, I mean, I agree very much, that's very important. The points people have made about the Maliki government, yeah, I think it's absolutely right. I mean, I went to a conference in Brussels at Easter this year, where there was already the talk about Fallujah being liberated and all the things that had gone on. And it was clear then, firstly, that the sectarian divisions were very, very great. This was largely Sunnis at the conference, from Anbar and other parts of the west of Iraq. It was also, people talked and they had films about political prisoners who were, you know, people who were from the Arab Spring and so on. So you can see how this sort of built up under the Maliki government. It's also worth saying that when it came to Mosul, of course, the Iraqi army, which as I understand it, you can buy a commission, it's like it was in Victorian times in this country, that you can become a general if you've got enough money in the Iraqi army. And this was an army created by the United States and its allies in order to supposedly defend this failed state that they created, just abandoned Mosul and abandoned its weapons, which are now in the hands of ISIS. I mean, that's what actually happened on the thing. So I think that's important to understand. It's also important to understand that, of course, the resistance to Maliki was not just ISIS. It has incorporated large sections of the previous resistance. As people have said, some of them are now wanting to break with ISIS. But if you ask me, I think they, you know, this is a very dangerous situation for them, they may find it's not so easy to do. Does the US want to destroy ISIS? Well, I tend to agree with Joe. It's kind of yes and no. I think that, you know, on one level, this is a monster that's got out of control, and this is what, you know, this is what they've created. But of course, they've created it by supporting various other. I mean, large sections of the FSA have gone over to ISIS. That's a fact. It's simply a fact. So the people. It's not true that they funded ISIS, but they funded people who now are part of ISIS, and that is something which is a huge problem. They obviously now fear that this is something which, I mean, and it isn't just Iraq. I mean, for God's sake, if you look at Libya, the whole of the British embassy had to be evacuated, less than a month ago, and British citizens on a Royal Navy vessel taken from the country because the situation is absolutely disastrous in Libya as a result of the intervention 3 years ago. So I think they've created these monsters. There's all sorts of problems that are out of control. The real question is their only answer to this is more of the same. They you know, let's find a different group of people to ally with. Let's bomb these people. Let's do all the same again. This is exactly what they've done successively with different groups of people, and it's always turned out to be a disaster. So anyway, yeah, and that's it. That's long enough for me.
Thanks very much, Lindsey.